Halo Infinite came out almost 3 years ago. It's been a long time since this finally released to the public after an absolutely grueling development cycle. We're not going to talk about all of the issues that 343 had getting this project shipped and out to the public, but we are going to talk about where it has been versus where it is now. Previously, I'd made a video discussing the game about a year after its launch and where it had been, and honestly, not much had changed from its original version of the game. You know, a few new features were added, but by and large, it was the launch state of Halo Infinite. They were just trying to get it together, and 343 was having a really hard time making this thing happen. However, nearly 3 years later, we're in a much different position, and to a point where it actually shocked me about just how many of the features that we as the community begged 343 to, finally implement have been added to the game. At what cost, though, is the question, and is it too little too late? We don't know. The thing I find interesting, though, is despite Halo Infinite being in a much better condition than it was on launch, and basically all the stuff that we just wanted for the game to be available is actually now able to be played in Infinite in current day, but it hasn't had the same level of resurgence in player base that some other FPS games that have saved themselves have been able to achieve. Now, these are Steam charts, and maybe it's a little bit different because Infinite and Halo specifically is predominantly an Xbox game, and we don't have those numbers to be exact. And I do feel that the console numbers for Halo were going to be overall stronger on Xbox, but I would still suspect that they're going to follow the same general patterns of ups and downs in the player base. You'll see that some months they report a really strong resurgence in the actual player count, and that is usually a result of something like campaign co-op or even releasing Forge mode, but it hasn't been able to have the same staying power as a few of the other games that it's competing with have been able to achieve. Why is that, though? I'm not really sure, but basically all of the bones that were missing from Halo Infinite that defined the experience that it should have been were just not present when it launched. We all know that. The campaign did not even have co-op functionality when the game released. That's something that Halo has been practically renowned for, and the more I think about it in retrospect, the fact that 343 decided on committing to an open world style campaign yet did not have co-op functionality at launch was an absolute crime. At that point, if co-op wasn't going to work, I feel like they should have just scrapped that entire open world idea entirely. But obviously, we know how long and how grueling the development of Halo Infinite was and how much actually did change, and in the campaign specifically, how much of the open world they had to sacrifice to make it happen. The silver lining here, I guess, is that the Infinite campaign does have co-op functionality now, which is good, but and when I play it now, I'm like, God, it's so obvious that from the start, this was meant to be played co-op. The fact that we even gaslit ourselves to think that, oh, this is probably a fine solo campaign experience, or maybe that's how it was meant, it's literally not. This is a co-op game for sure. So the campaign has changed quite significantly since its launch, and its functionality for cooperative play has been restored, thank God, but I just have this feeling that it's too little too late. I mean, it took years to get campaign cooperative running for a game that was already out in live service. That is unacceptable. Now, we're not going to talk about all of the challenges that I know 343 was facing getting this campaign to work properly, but the fact that they were there and were not addressed in the first couple of years of the game is pretty telling. I look back at my oldest footage of Halo Infinite, and specifically when it first came out, and it's actually night and day compared to the state of the game and the condition where it's at the moment. So many quality of life and sweeping changes have been added to Halo Infinite, and some of these were incredibly positive. Stuff like changes and, leniency on the armor core system, which when it first released was probably one of the worst cosmetic microtransaction systems I've ever seen in a modern video game, nonetheless an FPS game. It was real bad, and it's still not my favorite, but the armor core system has been alleviated to some degree where it gives you a lot more control of your customization. It felt like so divided and locked down before in a way that just didn't make sense. And the way that it intertwined with progression was incredibly frustrating when Halo Infinite first came out. Now, the progression system in general has seen many major changes since its launch. I mean, practically every single update has moved the goalpost in favor of the player. I mean, bro, when Infinite first released, the progression was so monotonous and tedious, unbelievably slow. The way it is now, and as it relates to seasons and the battle pass, still isn't my favorite system in the entire world, but admittedly is so much better than its initial conception of it. Honestly, I have to give 343 some credit here. They may not always be the most timely when it comes to adding updates and adjusting things that we would like to see happen in Halo Infinite, but I suppose late is better than never. But when you see it now, it's just such a damn shame that this isn't the state of the game that Halo Infinite was when it first came out. I think if that were the case, we would be in a much different scenario, and I do feel Infinite would be a much more developed game than even where it is today. The problem is there was a lot of shakeup at 343 even since when I last reported on this and really have been playing it. Bonnie Ross has left 343. Joe Staten even left 343. There was a moment in time where Joe Staten was looked at as like the Jesus Christ of Halo, and he was going to save Infinite. There was going to be campaign DLC and all of these sweeping changes, and I'm sure he had a hand in a lot of the improvements that Infinite has seen over the years. But the fact that he has now completely left the studio means that Infinite is likely not going to see any more of this creative input that Joe Staten would have on the game. There's been so many layoffs at 343 and so much like shuffling around of leadership that I'm not even really sure who's entirely running the show and calling the shots these days. The thing is, Infinite is more or less done with major updates at this point, which is also why I felt like it was a good time to now re-examine the game of Halo Infinite and see where it's at in its final state versus where it is on launch. It's almost a perfect representation of where it was versus where it is now. And I'm sure there's going to be little updates that come out throughout time, but nothing too crazy that's going to fundamentally change the bones of the game. What you see is what you get at the moment. So while we covered a lot of the good stuff in regards to campaign co-op, changes to the armor core and progression system, that stuff is great. But to me, where the most significant improvements to Halo Infinite were made were in the bread and butter of what Halo is. And this means game modes, playlists, maps, features, and so on. The social interaction has been greatly improved already, and the fact that plenty of maps have been released post-launch, but most of them have been pretty recently, and those of you who played Infinite maybe at its launch or shortly after probably haven't experienced the vast majority of these. A lot of the new maps are great, and they've even brought back a lot of old fan favorites from Halo 3, Halo Reach, etc. And as I've been playing more, I've been realizing, damn, like there's so much variety and replayability. Just the fact that these maps are in the game alone. I mean, there's this whole Halo 3 refueled playlist, and it's great. And with Infinite's core gameplay, this is one of those things that I actually felt for the most part everybody was on board with. You know, the return to a slightly more sandboxy gameplay like classic Halo was great. You know, there's no create a class and stuff, so it feels like these older maps work really well with Infinite's mechanics. Of course, there is sprint and you can move a little faster throughout these, but it doesn't break the immersion or the experience too much, and I think that's why these older maps work so well here. Other game modes that have been Halo staples are now finally present in Infinite. I mean, Infection got added like 2 years later, but it's finally in the game. And I like Halo Infinite's version of Infection. It is a little different. It's more, you know, a take on like the Banished, and it means that the infected move like incredibly fast. It's a little bit more fast-paced than old Halos used to. It's fine. I like it a lot. It's not my favorite version of Infection I've ever played, but it's present, it's in the game, and it's a good time. And if this version of Infection isn't for you, there's plenty of different, you know, custom browsers that you can play that have a more classic feeling version of Infected. Compared to 2021 and most of 2022, I've been enjoying the community-driven content on Infinite almost maybe even more than the real vanilla content on the game that's from 343. This is the stuff I'm talking about, man. This is where Halo thrives. You know, speaking of which, a custom browser was finally implemented. It only took, you know, 2.5 years or something, but it is finally here. The problem is I felt like the customs browser doesn't seem to be as active as maybe I, you know, would expect it to be. There's not as many players, you know, hovering around at any given time. Sure, there's a couple experiences that you can just jump into and play at any given moment, but it's not as populated as you might imagine. I think that is largely due to Halo Infinite just not having the highest player base anymore. There has been slight upticks when something like Forge released or, you know, campaign co-op and so on. Like when these big features do come out, they see a little bit of a comeback, but it hasn't been able to quite retain players maybe in the same way that it would have if it had been, you know, how it is on launch, because I think a lot of what was missing was the social interaction, and it's gotten better, but it's still not perfect. There's still no real pre-game lobby where you can interact with people, which is a real shame because of the refreshing amount of playlists that are currently available in Halo Infinite. That element of Halo still seems to be somewhat lacking despite all of their best efforts to improve the quality of the game, add content and core features that have been present in practically every Halo game in existence. I have to admit, it's gotten a lot better. I cannot deny that, but I still hold to my word that I believe Infinite is the most antisocial Halo game that we have, and I think that's just a large part of its overall design choices that it made, and they really did try to alleviate much of this, but I just don't think they took it far enough. It can still feel very isolated at times, especially compared to past Halo titles, and I'm not sure precisely what would alleviate this issue, but I can definitely feel it every time I play the game. So while 343 have have done an outstanding job at picking the game back up to where it probably should have been when it launched in terms of the content that it's offering, primarily on the PvP side. I mean, the multiplayer experience now is just fantastic. There's so many different playlists, great modes. Forge is incredible. Obviously, a customs browser is an amazing feature that should have been there when the game came out, but all of this stuff is to say that the core gameplay of Halo Infinite, I think, is fantastic. And it's the Halo game that I've probably enjoyed the core gameplay most, probably for at least over a decade. It's so good. I think Infinite's core moment-to-moment multiplayer is absolutely phenomenal, and they've always had good bones on it, but it's only gotten better over time. And they even have more to offer outside of even just the PvP multiplayer experience. They've recently added Firefight, and this was, over the last couple of months or so, and it's a little bit different to how it's been before, just like Infection, where it's not quite as you remember. This is like a King of the Hill mode where you need to fight the Covenant to maintain control of different like hills and hardpoints around the map, and that can be pretty fun. I think Firefight is interesting here. You even have a heroic version of it if you want to turn up the difficulty, and I think it's very enjoyable whichever way you play it, but I cannot say I honestly prefer Infinite's version of Firefight to something like ODST. I think that is still the superior Firefight experience, but the fact that it's in the game now is still much appreciated. It's just like, couldn't we have had this on launch? I mean, when Forge mode came out, people were making Firefight levels like this in like a day. And same thing with Infection. People were making these experiences that the community had been begging 343 to add to Halo Infinite in literally a day or two, and you could go and play these experiences. And I'm not really sure what 343's like holdup was for all of this stuff. If the community was able to make these almost on par experiences to a professional studio level literally in no time flat, I don't know what they were doing over there. But I mean, it's good now that it's in the game, but it's like, where was this stuff years ago? The vast majority of players who have stopped playing Infinite are never going to come back and experience this stuff, and that sucks, because honestly, I'm really happy with the current state of Halo Infinite. I can't believe I'm saying that, but 3 years later after its release, I'm like, wow, this game is pretty damn good. I cannot believe the actual turnaround that it's made, but it hasn't seen quite the same resurgence in player count to reflect that, which is just goes to show you that even if they get the game together many years later, it's not necessarily guaranteed that everybody's going to come back and enjoy it. You've really got to nail your launch, or at least do it moderately well, so that people still have faith in your game. I believe that was one of the core issues, is people lost faith in 343, they lost faith in Infinite, and they basically vowed to never come back. Now, unfortunately, it's not all good when it comes to its live service, because one of the things I feel was incredibly lacking over the long term of Halo Infinite was its additions to its sandbox. And this was very surprising to me, especially considering all of the other maps and modes that have been added alongside that, but the sandbox did not really get updated to reflect that either. I was willing initially to give 343 the benefit of the doubt and be like, hey, maybe this doesn't have the largest weapon selection that we've ever seen in Halo, but this is a live service game, and it's going to get consistently updated for many years, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot more weapons to enjoy in the game. I even talked about that, years ago, but that was not really true. I mean, we got pretty much one new gun, which is the Bandit. It's essentially a DMR, and that's how it functions. It's fine. I like the Bandit. It's a good cross between like the BR and the Commando. It's pretty cool, but that's really about it. There were so many other classic weapons that people had been asking for and requesting that just never made it. Stuff like the Covenant Carbine, or the original shotgun, or the Fuel Rod. Some of these are even in the game files, and I'm sure they probably had plans to do the stuff, but it just didn't happen for one reason or another. Some new equipment did get added. Like, there was a few things that I hadn't seen before when I got back onto play, but weapons, there was pretty much nothing. The closest thing we got to having brand new genuine weapons in the game was with the Super Fiesta mode and anything that included the campaign variant weapons. And so, this would include stuff like the Unbound Plasma Pistol, the Duelist Energy Sword, or the Flexfire Sniper Rifle. These are great. Obviously, they behave very similarly to their original weapon counterparts, maybe with a couple of different, attributes here and there. The damage might be different, and they might behave a little funky and so on, and they're kind of different weapons, but also not really. This was merely a substitute for having genuine brand new weapons additions to the sandbox. Now, I understand that Halo Infinite had very particular balance with its sandbox items, and maybe the core gameplay was all catered around that, but I just don't really think that adding anything brand new would have disturbed it all that much. I think that ecosystem still would have been intact, and we would have had room for something like, a Covenant Carbine or a fuel rod or a Spartan laser. Just some fun stuff that's been in Halo before that people would love to play with in Infinite in its very solid core gameplay. To me, there's just absolutely no excuse for this, especially 3 years later. And I didn't even play it that much, but Halo 5, I'm almost certain, launched with more weapons in the game than Halo Infinite has now. For as much as I praise 343 for getting Halo Infinite back on the rails and bringing it up to par of where it definitely should have been many years ago, this is one of those things that is simply lacking and I cannot excuse. The weapon sandbox is the most lackluster and hollow feeling in any Halo game to date. And again, I think what's fascinating is many FPS games have been able to turn themselves around through their live service model and restore somewhat of a respectable, stable player base. But it feels like Infinite, despite all of its efforts, it had one big month in October of 2023, and since then has tumbled back down to pretty much where it was before, despite all of these quality of life improvements, and the game undeniably being in a far better condition. But it looks like that just simply wasn't enough to recapture players' attention and captivate them once again like they had on launch. Like, the fall off is unbelievably insane when you compare to other games that have experienced somewhat of a resurgence. Where it stands today, 343 have put Infinite in a much more respectable state, and the game is actually in fantastic shape, all things considered. It's still probably my favorite Halo game since maybe Reach, honestly. Even since day one, I always felt Infinite had unbelievably solid core gameplay, but it was lacking in features and content and modes and that social interaction that we all crave in Halo games that made it so great. And 3 years later, it's like they've kind of gotten their act together. They've pulled themselves together quite a lot, and I have to commend 343 for a lot of the quality of life changes, the maps, modes, game modes, etc. that have made Infinite a much better experience than we had originally. And the thing is, if the state of the game right now, if this had been what we received in the beginning, and then we built on top of that foundation, I feel like Halo Infinite would still be very alive and thriving today. Not that it isn't, it still has a very stable player base, but it's not nearly as big as it was when it first came out. That's not even close. At this point, I can honestly look you in the eye and say Halo Infinite multiplayer is good. It's very fun, and I can actually very much recommend it. It's a little bit unfortunate that 343 is more or less done with major updates, so we're not going to see anything big come out for this. This is basically the end product of what we're going to get, and I feel that ties a nice little bow on how Infinite was then versus now. We get a good comparison of how it used to be versus the state it's in today, and I hope 343 learned a lot from this. There's been, much shakeup there, so I don't know what the plan with Halo will be going forward, but I really do hope that everybody learned from this experience. And since in my last video I didn't do an outro, I